Right now, in the city nearest you, there are probably more pigeons than there are people on your street. They sit on power lines. They crowd around park benches. They peck at crumbs outside every coffee shop you've ever walked past. And somehow, despite this unbelievable abundance of free-roaming meat wandering around in plain sight, almost nobody eats them. That should strike you as strange. Humans are not usually this picky about a walking food source. So what happened? Here's the twist that makes this even stranger. Pigeons used to be dinner. For most of human history, they were one of the most prized meats you could put on a table. The bird sitting on that traffic light right now, the one people call a flying rat, is technically the exact same species that medieval nobility bred, protected, and ate constantly. Columba livia, the rock dove. Somewhere between the castle kitchen and the city sidewalk, this bird went from delicacy to disgrace. And the story of how that happened tells you more about human psychology than it does about the pigeon itself. Let's go back. Way back. Pigeons were domesticated somewhere around 5,000 years ago, likely in Mesopotamia, making them one of the very first birds humans ever tamed, alongside chickens and geese. Ancient Egyptians ate them, and archaeological evidence suggests pigeon meat was common enough in the ancient Near East to be considered an everyday protein rather than a luxury. Romans built elaborate towers called columbaria just to house and breed them for the table, and wealthy Roman households sometimes kept thousands of birds at once, treating pigeon husbandry as seriously as any other form of livestock farming. By medieval Europe, owning a dovecote, a special tower structure built specifically to raise pigeons, was often a legal privilege reserved for nobility and the church. This wasn't a minor detail. In parts of France and England, the right to keep a dovecote was tightly regulated by law precisely because of how valuable the food source was. Peasants were frequently barred from owning one, while the pigeons themselves were legally permitted to forage freely across everyone's farmland, including land the peasants themselves worked. This created a strange one-sided arrangement. Pigeons owned by the lord would eat grain from a peasant's field for free, then return home each evening to be fed, protected, and eventually eaten by the same lord who owned the tower. It's part of why pigeon keeping became such a visible symbol of aristocratic privilege, and why peasant uprisings in places like pre-revolutionary France specifically targeted dovecotes as symbols of feudal inequality. If you had a dovecote on your land, you had a guaranteed, low-effort, high-protein food source that basically fed itself. The birds would fly out, forage on other people's crops for free, and fly home to roost and breed. From a pure calorie efficiency standpoint, it was one of the smartest food systems humans ever built. Young pigeons raised for meat even got their own special name that still shows up on high-end restaurant menus today: Squab. If you've ever seen Squab on a fancy tasting menu and wondered what it actually was, now you know. It's pigeon, the exact same bird standing on the sidewalk outside. So why did an entire species go from centerpiece protein to universal symbol of urban filth? Part of the answer is genuinely about biology, but a much bigger part is about psychology. And sociologist Colin Jerolmack has spent an enormous amount of his career studying exactly this shift. In his book, The Global Pigeon, Jerolmack traces how the same bird occupies wildly different cultural roles depending entirely on context. A domesticated racing pigeon, groomed and fed by a dedicated hobbyist, is treated like a prized athlete, sometimes worth thousands of dollars, flown in competitive races, and cared for with the same devotion someone might show a racehorse. A feral pigeon on a subway platform, meanwhile, is treated like vermin, something to be shooed away, netted off, or poisoned by city pest control. Genetically, there is often barely any difference between the two birds. What separates them is not biology, it's ownership, cleanliness, and control. Jerolmack's broader argument goes even further than that. He suggests that pigeons function almost like a mirror for whatever a given society happens to value or fear at a given moment. In wartime, pigeons were treated as heroes, literally decorated with medals for carrying messages across enemy lines. During urbanization, that same bird became a nuisance, cited in city ordinances, blamed for property damage, and eventually rebranded as a public health hazard. Nothing about the animal itself changed dramatically across these different eras. What changed was the role humans needed it to play. That distinction matters more than you'd think. Humans, it turns out, aren't disgusted by animals based on some fixed biological rule. We're disgusted by animals we can't control, don't understand, or associate with dirt and disease, regardless of whether that association is actually justified. And pigeons, unfortunately, checked every one of those boxes once cities exploded in size. As dovecotes fell out of use and cities industrialized, domesticated pigeons that were no longer needed for food or messaging were released or simply escaped. Without owners, without controlled breeding, without a managed food source, they adapted. They started nesting on building ledges instead of dovecotes, because ledges look almost identical to the rocky cliff faces their wild rock dove ancestors originally nested on. They started eating garbage instead of managed feed, because garbage was what cities offered in abundance. In other words, pigeons didn't become dirty. They became opportunistic, the same way any intelligent, adaptable animal would if you took away its structured food source and handed it a dumpster instead. But once that shift happened, the psychological branding stuck, and it stuck hard. The phrase, "rats with wings," now one of the most common descriptions of urban pigeons, is widely credited to a 1966 New York City Parks Commissioner named Thomas Hoving, who reportedly used it while trying to justify removing pigeon feed vendors from public parks. The line was catchy, it was quotable, and it worked exactly as intended. Within a generation, an animal that had fed European nobility for centuries was rebranded, almost overnight in historical terms, as urban filth. Once an animal earns that label, actually eating it becomes psychologically very hard to reverse, even if nothing about the meat itself has changed. There's also a real, measurable health angle here. And this part isn't just branding. Urban ecologists have specifically studied disease prevalence in feral pigeon populations, because unlike managed dovecote birds of the past, city pigeons interact constantly with garbage, pollution, and dense, uncontrolled flock environments. Feral pigeons can carry pathogens including Chlamydia psittaci, the bacteria responsible for psittacosis, along with various strains of Salmonella and other bacteria linked to accumulated droppings in nesting areas. Dense roosting sites, the kind you'll find under highway overpasses or inside abandoned buildings, can concentrate these pathogens in droppings that pile up over months or years, which is genuinely a different risk profile than a bird raised in a clean, managed enclosure. None of this means a pigeon is inherently more dangerous to eat than a chicken from a factory farm, which carries its own well-documented Salmonella and Campylobacter risks that public health agencies track constantly. But it does mean urban pigeons specifically, the ones you actually see on your street, are genuinely a less controlled, less predictable protein source than the birds raised for meat historically. The danger was never really in the species. It was in the complete lack of any food safety system standing behind it. This is actually the key detail that trips a lot of people up. The pigeons that were eaten for thousands of years were not the same population, in practice, as the pigeons sitting outside your apartment right now. Historical squab came from birds deliberately bred, fed clean-managed grain, and kept in a controlled dovecote environment specifically to be eaten. Modern urban pigeons are self-sustaining scavengers, living entirely off whatever a city happens to discard. Same species, radically different food safety profile. That distinction rarely survives when the story gets simplified down to people used to eat pigeon and now they don't. Here's where it gets even more interesting, and where researchers studying urban wildlife have found something the branding narrative completely misses. Ecologist Elizabeth Carlin, who has researched how pigeon plumage and biology have shifted specifically in dense urban environments like New York City, has documented that feral pigeons are actively evolving in response to city life. Her research on plumage color variation found patterns suggesting that pigeon coloration may be linked to traits like stress tolerance and immune response, essentially showing that city pigeons aren't just genetically identical leftovers of their domesticated ancestors. They're a population actively adapting in real time to an entirely new ecological niche that never existed before industrial cities did. In other words, the pigeon on your windowsill isn't the same as the pigeon nobility ate off silver plates 600 years ago. Not really. It's descended from it, genetically almost identical to it, but it has spent generations adapting to a completely different world, and its biology reflects that. So why don't we eat pigeon everywhere, despite the sheer abundance sitting right in front of us? Not because the meat suddenly became inedible. Squab is still considered a delicacy in French, Chinese, and Middle Eastern cuisine right now, sold at real restaurants, sourced from real farms that still raise pigeons specifically for the table, exactly the way dovecote owners did centuries ago. In France, squab remains a fixture of classical cuisine, often roasted whole and served rare, the way it has been prepared for generations. In parts of China, pigeon is braised, roasted, or used in soup, and it's specifically the young, farm-raised bird, not anything plucked off a city street. The meat itself was never the problem, and it never stopped being eaten. It just stopped being eaten from the population you can actually see. What changed is control. What changed is branding, cemented by one well-placed quote from a city official trying to solve a park maintenance problem. What changed is that an animal humans once carefully managed became, almost by accident, an animal humans simply stopped managing at all, and in the gap left behind, disgust filled in where structure used to be. A domesticated animal without an owner doesn't stop being an animal. It just stops being anyone's responsibility, and an animal that belongs to no one, city after city, generation after generation, eventually gets treated like it belongs nowhere at all. Right now, in the city nearest you, there are probably more pigeons than there are people on your street. They're not disgusting because of what they are. They're disgusting because of what we stopped doing with them. The more we learn about the past, the better we understand ourselves. If this video sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Phoenix Primeval for more fascinating stories from history, science, and human evolution. Thanks for watching.